we go. It's the 12th of December and another window lies before us. Let's get that open. Okay, and what's the note inside? Your painting style. How has your style changed over the years? What techniques have you found work for you and don't work for you? Well, my painting style has certainly changed hugely over the, I don't want to add up, but 40 years or so I've been wargaming. More than that, sadly. What's consistent across all of that time has been the fact that I'm not a great painter. I could certainly never attempt to rival the greats such as Kevin Dallimore or friends such as John Savage or Jeff Davis or even our very own Sydney, whose brushwork amazes and inspires, well, me, but I think all of us. I've tried things like the Foundry 3-paint system, but I just can't get it right. So I'm very reliant on using tricks that I've learned over the years to get a decent paint job. I suppose it'll be pretty obvious that my painting days began with Airfix enamel paints. I think most people of my age didn't have any other option, really, unless you wanted to use house paint. My earliest plastic armies were ACW, and I simply bought a can of grey and a can of blue spray paint and zapped that onto them. After that, I just painted the rifles brown and the hands and faces pink, and the job was done. Looking back, it was a terrible job. The grey paint that I used, well, I got both cans of paint actually from a car parts shop. The grey paint was designed to be an undercoat for cars, and it had a very rough, grainy feel to it. And the blue was gloss, and I'd never heard of varnishing figures at that point in time. So that's how they stayed. A really horrible texture on the Confederates, and the Union troops looked very glitzy. I should have put Go Faster stripes on them, I guess. My first metal figures I painted when I was about 12. I simply block painted the colours, and I think pretty much everybody just block painted the colours in those days, and that was it. I just painted straight onto the bare metal. They were ECW 15mm figures from minifigs. And I remember painting lashings of blood running down the pike shafts, which is slightly ridiculous, but it appealed to me at that time as a bloodthirsty teen, or pre-teen, I guess. I suppose my first real step on the road to learning to paint was when I was 18. I joined the local club, and that really opened my eyes to figures painted, well, much better than I'd ever seen. Someone there said that they undercoated their figures in white and painted over that, so I gave it a go, and quickly I discovered that if I thinned the paint with white spirit, I could get a very effective wash that, when it was applied over the undercoat, pretty much shaded the figure for me. In fact, when I see photos of people painting with the latest trendy contrast paints, it reminds me very much of that method that I was using, and the results don't look that different despite 45 years having gone in between. In those days, that was quite revolutionary. Looking back, I think they must have looked rather washed out, but that was perfectly acceptable for me at that time. And actually, I've been using washes ever since in slightly different ways. The next change I made was a shift to a black undercoat. This was really revolutionary at the time. I remember a chap at the club had armies that he'd black lined, which is a technique that's rather died out now, probably, thank goodness. The idea was that if you were painting a leather belt or whatever, you'd paint it brown and then add black lines to either side of the belt so that it made the brown belt really stand out. You basically paint your figures and then add the lines. You'd see it in some of the hobby magazines and it would look absolutely fantastic. But in reality, I never met anybody who could get the same result. And I wouldn't even have tried. All of the chap I knew's figures had eyes painted on, and the black lines that he put round the eyes made it look like they were wearing heavy mascara. And unfortunately, he always added rosy cheeks to his figures, and the combined effect resulted in what looked like an army of overly made-up catamites from some potentate's harem. But anyway, shifting to a black undercoat certainly allowed a similar effect. You kind of almost painted up to the belt, but not quite, and left a little bit of this black undercoat showing. Very much the same connotations. Nowadays, I do tend to use a black undercoat for most of my figures, but I don't really use the technique of painting up and leaving a black line any longer. I have to admit, I don't enjoy painting. I'm doing it because I want to get the figures on the table, so my objective is speed rather than beauty. Now, that said, I do want the figures to look half decent, especially as I'm likely to be taking photographs of them for, Lard magazine or maybe even a set of rules. And a big, excuse me, a big addition to my painting arsenal was inks, which I used extensively to get shading. I only ever had a black and a brown ink. I never bothered with other colours. Certainly a sepia ink. A brown ink can actually come out a bit too orangey, so I went with sepia. I used to paint the figures and then wash them in a diluted ink that would give some kind of depth where it settled in the crevices, and that would be the job done. Over the years, I've shifted from inks to washes, such as the Army Painter range, which I really do like. However, my technique has become a bit more refined with the use, as we'll cover. My first step now is to undercoat a model. I don't always use black. I do sometimes use brown, and in really odd situations where maybe I'm painting a force in white uniforms, like Austrians in the Napoleonic Wars or Finns in the Winter War, I might use a grey. Excuse me. I use a spray on enamel, as only weirdos use brush-on undercoats, Sydney. I normally use a cheap car undercoat, although if I go with a brown, which I might do for if I'm painting figures in khaki or sort of 8th Army type light khaki colour, I will use a Humbrol. I think it's called Dark Earth. Anyway, I always spray outside, as I find that spray cans can really affect my chest, which serves me right because I used to smoke 80 cigarettes a day, so that's my particular cross to bear. Once that's dry, I apply the first colour. I'm told that I paint backwards, in that I paint the outer layers of clothing first and then work inwards, painting the skin last. This apparently horrifies some people, but it's how I've always done it. And I've always felt that if I paint the face first, it will just get ruined when I paint the rest of it. So as that's one of the bits that is the most important part of the model to get looking good, I've always felt that leaving that till last allows it to remain, pristine. The first colour I put on is the main uniform colour. If the uniform's different, I might put a tunic. I would put the tunic colour on first, or jacket, and then the trousers after that. Then any cuffs or lace work is done. All of this is just block painting. I just slap the colours on. I'm not attempting to do any tonal variations here. After that, I add the belts and the straps, and then the rifle or whatever weapon the troops have got. And once that's done, I wash the whole thing. I tend to use the dark wash or the strong wash from Army Shader, but I will mix them with about 50% water, might be 40%. It's not precise. I certainly don't bother measuring it, but I add water to that so that the wash doesn't dominate. I also used to use the Army Painter dips, but I found them to be rather too strong for my liking. Once the wash is dry, I will actually then add some highlights to the uniform, usually 2 layers, which reinforces the shading caused by the wash. And after that, I highlight the belts and the straps. Then I go back and I wash specifically on or around the belt. Now, thinking back, that's almost a bit like the black lining that we talked about, and I will probably use a different colour wash to highlight. I'm more likely to use the blacker of the washes. I believe that's called, you get light, you get dark, and then I think you get strong, which is the black one. I'm more likely to use the very dark black toned wash for that, which again I'm watering down. I might water that down a little bit more, maybe 60% water to 40% in the wash, and that I just touch, I think people might call it a pin wash or something like that, around the belts and around the straps. And after that, once that's dry, I go back and add some fairly strong highlights to the belts and straps to contrast them with the wash, and that really makes the belts and straps pop out when they are differentiated from the tunic by that wash, and then a fairly bright highlight to get them to stand out. And only then, when I've got everything done, do I do the flesh. I tend to use a darker reddish brown as an undercoat, maybe something like a Vallejo Cavalry brown, if I've got it. I always put that on and think, blimey, that's far too dark and far too red. But then it always makes a really, really good base for painting up from. I often, though, bottle out and go with a slightly lighter colour than that. So maybe something like a red leather type of consistency or colour. I put that on, then I paint on the flesh, and I pretty much do that as though I'm block painting. And then once that's dry, I use a reddish brown flesh wash, which brings out the detail. I do like the Army Painter flesh wash shade, which I think is really nice. But if I haven't got that to hand, I might mix up my own with the Army Painter red wash and the light tone wash, which pretty much comes out the same thing. Let that dry. And then I highlight. Now, if I'm doing this perfectly, I'll highlight the nose and just a touch on either of the nostrils. I'll highlight the cheekbones and the chin. All of my figures have the classic Kirk Douglas dimpled chins with a dot on each side. I highlight the knuckles and the back of the hands, but I must admit I'm a bit imprecise about this. I really don't have the patience. So, the nostrils tend to get left out. The cheekbones and the chin are always done, but I'm not overly precise because, as I say, I'm looking to get them on the table, and quite frankly, from 3 or 4 foot, a highlight is a highlight, and that's all you can see. Finally, hair, and then the boots. I mean, I do the boots last because I've just forgotten to do them earlier. I never remembered to do them earlier, and it doesn't trouble me. So that it also allows me to, especially if you're looking at something like jackboots or whatever, or puttees, it allows me to get all of that painting done without clopping black or brown paint all over it. Finally, hair, and then the boots. I mean, I do the boots last because I've just forgotten to do them earlier. I never remembered to do them earlier, and it doesn't trouble me. So that it also allows me to, especially if you're looking at something like jackboots or whatever, or puttees, it allows me to get all of that painting done without clopping black or brown paint all over it. Finally, I have a general glance over and see what I've missed. I normally tend to have missed something like brass buckles on packs and things like that, which I add in at this point in time. Again, I'll go back and do a bit of a pin wash around that, and then maybe highlight that up once that has dry, just to get them to stand out. And any extra highlights, if I think anything really needs accentuating, just generally tidy it up. And that's it. But of course, it isn't it. A wise man once said to me, if you can't paint well, focus on bases and faces. So that's what I tend to do. My basing technique has changed drastically over the years. At the outset, it was just green cardboard with the figures glued on top. I moved on to filler. I think I used a Tetrian, which I used to powdered filler, which I used to mix up and put on the base and then paint that green. The advantage that had was it hid the figure base and it all looked like it was one thing, but it was still just a plain green colour. After that, I discovered something called base text, which I used in green originally, and then moved to a light earth colour and started using static grass at that stage. I now use sharp sand, which I use with a Vallejo sepia game wash. I basically put the sand on with PVA glue, allow that to dry, and then just add the wash, which I then dry brush over with a couple of colours, which are, I've got one of them here, by Deco Art. They're just sort of general painters acrylic paints, but they're much cheaper than using something like Vallejo. And I use a couple of colours which Gareth in Wales suggested ages and ages ago, and I haven't got the darker one with me, so I can't remember what it is, but it's a golden colour. And then on top of that, I use a sand colour, a light sand colour. Once I've done that, I then add my own mix of static grass and flock, and that varies depending on what geographical location I'm looking at, but that'll have some sort of mixed detritus in there, like leaves and maybe the odd plant or something like that. And then to finish off, I add a few tufts, and I find that once you've got a fairly attractive base on the figure, that tends to hide the fact that my painting isn't brilliant. Over the years, I've varied the kit that I used, and I found it worth investing in a good brush for fine detail. I use the Winsor & Newton 7 series. I tend to like an O or an 00 brush for detail. Any more than that, and you might as well paint with a single cat's hair that you plucked out of the creature. But for block work, just the initial paint jobs, any old cheap brush will do, as long as it can approximate a point. And I don't see any point in using high quality brushes just to do general block work. They're not designed for it. It doesn't do them any good, and I might as well just use a cheap brush. And I tend to buy packets of 15 or 20 brushes anytime I pop into Hobbycraft and think, oh, I'm running out. But you can get those packs of watercolour brushes online, which are perfectly good. I do like a wet palette, which might be contentious, and our old mate Ken up in Yorkshire will think I'm some kind of southern reprobate because of that. Although he and I actually come from the same hometown, but there we go. But I don't like wet palettes because it allows me to mix a colour and keep that going, because I never bother with that nonsense. But it just keeps the paint live for longer. I use less paint. I don't have to keep faffing about adding water. It keeps the paint live, and I like it. I had several false starts with wet palettes, largely because people told me about them and I tried making my own, or I bought cheap versions of it on eBay and they were just rubbish and I threw them in the bin. However, I chucked a few quid at this and bought the Army Painter wet palette set, and I have not looked back. It is absolutely brilliant. I put the wet palette in the workshop about a month ago, and I took it out 2 weeks later and the paint was still live. I honestly couldn't believe it. Now that might be because it's the perfect time of year. It's not frozen, the temperature's very cold, so I might as well have put it in the fridge. But absolutely brilliant, really good. I really do like a wet palette, and the Army Painter ones are fabulous. The best advice I can give to anyone starting out painting wargaming figures is don't worry about what other people think of your figures. Just paint to the standard that you're happy with. And when they're on the table, nobody really looks at the detail. All figures look pretty much the same when you're looking at them from 4 foot. And with luck, you'll be playing a TooFatLardies game, and so you'll be concentrating on what command decisions to make rather than on whether you've got an eyeball looking rather squintedly or not.